And is there anyone opposed to adopting the strategy? Perfect. I'll have that carried unanimously, please, Suad, if that's all right. Thank you very much. And we will move on to too much water, and I think we can have a break after that, if that's okay. Now we've got Ben and Kataraina next for too much water. I'll move this just as a heads up. Who would like to second? Councillor Cooper. And now we have added, I've had a bit of feedback from a couple of people over the week, and also an email from a councillor today, Kathy, just around the language of too much water. The policy is too much water. It's a catch-all statement, basically for a whole lot of things that involve too much water. But I think we've given permission under C for a bit of change to the language where it says too much water events and things like that. That may technically not be grammatically correct, so there'll be change to, I can't see the final word there, Suad. I can't remember what we had in the email, but anyway, you can read that. It just effectively means that the strategy can be changed a bit after we pass it, just to change the language so it's a bit more accurate. But Kataraina, oh, there we go. It'll start referring more to water-related impacts of climate change instead of too much water events. Cool. Okay, we have Ben that's leading this, Ben Brooks and Kataraina, and then we'll go to you for the presentation, or the discussion, sorry. Thank you.
Kia ora, thank you, Mr. Chair. And I've also got McLean Grindle, who I just want to acknowledge is here as well, and did a lot of the work producing this and also responding to your feedback. And it's also noting and apologising. So recommendation B was originally would say we would report back in May 22. That's the error, so it's been corrected as well to be May 2023. So this policy brings together a range of existing council positions into a new consolidated form. It clearly articulates council's current approach, and it will better prepare council and the community to respond to too much water events. And I'll continue to use that phrase until we come up with something new, but noting that there has been some feedback on that. So briefly, the statements of current direction affirm that council focuses on Auckland's long-term future without locking us into an unsustainable commitments. It ensures that council fulfills its leadership role and responsibility as a unitary authority, and it ensures that we take a consistent, planned and equitable approach to too much water events and risks. We are seeking approval of the current directions because although these are statements are not statements of new policy, they do respond to significant public policy issues, so we're bringing it to councillors for approval. These statements were workshopped with councillors in February, and the new version reflects the feedback we've received. And in addition, we have been working with our communications team to develop an Our Auckland release on the statements, and we're also developing a case study for responding to queries from the public on issues in this area. And as the project develops further, we'll be producing additional communication and engagement with the public. So we will continue to develop an adaptive decision pathways blueprint, and we will report this back to councillors in May 2023. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Happy to take any questions.
Sure to Ben, and thank you also to McLean, who has been there throughout. So sorry, didn't mean to not include you at the beginning. We have a question first up. I think I can see just Councillor Newman.
Good morning and thank you. So I look at too much water as you'll know when you get too much water when you have a significant rain event and the water can't drain away. How does this particular document talk to the planning and consenting framework that applies, particularly in this new permissive planning environment where developments can be largely permitted unless there are very exceptional circumstances that don't permit it, so as to ensure that those new developments are the neutrality of the stormwater that comes from those developments, hydrological neutrality. That's a key fundamental planning principle. It needs to ensure that new developments effectively can mitigate the stormwater effects. if they don't mitigate stormwater effects, you have too much water in your backyard, in your living room, etc. And I can see more and more and more of that happening. I can see the value of planning and of strategy and vision statements, but what I can't see is how this is going to be talking to the planning framework that's going to determine whether these new infill housing and subdivisions are permissible, but but neutral in terms of stormwater effects. So can you please give me some indication as to how the two marry up?
Kia ora, Councillor Newman. I think also you raised some similar issues in the workshop around stormwater. So I just step back to just remind us that this is a statement of our current role and responsibilities. So those are set out on page 7. And we have identified within that some of the challenges and constraints that exist within our current roles and responsibilities, and you're referring to those that currently exist in our Resource Management Act functions. And so this doesn't solve that. It states that those are issues and constraints and challenges we currently deal with, but also, given your feedback last time, we also put in, we had not put in our role as advocates, and some of those things we can advocate to government for. And so those constraints and challenges that you're identifying have been identified, but this doesn't change that. It acknowledges those challenges and constraints on the current role.
Yeah, follow-up. I guess what I'd like to know, Chair, and whether it's Kataraina or if it's Megan or His Worship that's addressing this, hydrological neutrality in relation to stormwater is absolutely crucial. You need to be able to contain stormwater effects of your development so it doesn't affect your neighbours adversely. In the environment of climate change, it seems to me that the principle of hydrological neutrality is being lost because we need to get more housing in. And then you say that to ministers, they say, well, local government needs to go and retrofit the infrastructure in place, but of course we can't do that. So how is this matter being received by central government beyond them basically saying, well, local government needs to get on with the infrastructure, but it doesn't do that, and local government's a problem? Because I don't want to continue to try and work in good faith around all these strategies and visions, only to discover that the expectation is on us to fund the fixes, but for which we don't have control of the trying to manage the problem for which we're supposed to fix.
Kia ora, Councillor. Through the chair, I'll take that. Look, again, I'm not going to be able to answer that appropriately for you or give you certainty. It is absolutely an issue. I know through the resource management reform process, for example, this issue's not, to my knowledge, been raised specifically, but the matters of who funds what and what the kind of minimum limits or impacts are is definitely being discussed. There's a role here from both central government but also local government, because of course we could change the unitary plan, we could do things within our regulatory role which would make this better or worse or greater or lesser. So there are some decisions that we could make around this should we so wish. But we've also, on top of that, of course, at the moment got the RM reform, which may also make this easier or harder to do, again, depending on that framework we get. So I guess I just want to assure you again that it's front of mind for me. I understand exactly what you're saying. I don't have an answer now. The work that Kat and the team will do over the next year, I think will help it, but I suspect we won't get a solution immediately. There are a few parties involved in this one. Kat, happy if you had any other comments.
We just wanted to acknowledge that is, Megan's talked about, it's not an issue that's being raised hugely at the moment, which is why we've put it as when we have seeming conflicts between national direction or national policy statements and standards where you're doing one thing and it's having adverse effects on something else you're trying to manage. So at this stage, we picked up that concern, picked it up as an advocacy item, and we'll need to work on that, but we don't have the fix inside the RMA given the reforms at the moment.
Thank you, both Megan and Kat, and thank you, Councillor Newman. And yes, I will get you to comment at the time. I guess just to follow up to that, Megan, is there any work being done on what we can put in the plan changes legally in relation to this, that we are the plan changes that we're doing in response to the government? Is there anything that we can add, or is it just sort of outside of our ability right now around stormwater detention, retention?
Yes. At the moment, in terms of the work we're doing around the National Policy Statement for Urban Development, so that's our big plan change that we're heading into for that August notification date. That is, I was going to say narrow, it's not narrow, but it's quite defined to that NPSUD, and we just don't have the staff or ability to go beyond that at the moment. So the answer is no in relation to that. We have been doing work, if you remember the conversations you've just had around water strategy, and over the last 18 months or so, we have been doing work around plan changes, or certainly evidence gathering and opportunities to improve the use of detention and retention tanks. So there is a little bit of work we've done there. I'm happy maybe to perhaps provide a bit of an update for you on that. I'm not quite across exactly where we've got to there. That may not need unitary plan or legislation change. That can be other things we can do there. So maybe if I could give you a heads up on that retention, detention issue might be useful.
Yeah, and I know it's not the whole picture of what Councillor Newman's speaking about, but I think it would go some way to at least giving us confidence there is some ability to do something in the short term. The next question, IMSB member Karen Wilson.
Kia ora. Thank you very much for the presentation. I'm just looking at clarity by way of a question. I guess I'll moot it in that manner. So in the MIS in para 34, it notes, well, actually I was reading it and I couldn't understand necessarily what that means. Building on existing policy and legislative requirements that were subject to engagement with foundational for future work. Can you indicate what that means, or what the approach is, or is that still in development?
Kia ora, Member Wilson. Just in reference to paragraph 34, what the statement does is reflect a number of pieces of work already undertaken, like Te Tāruki, Tāwhiri and Te Mauri o Te Wai. We're just recognising that this is a statement that pulls together existing work, and that there's been some fantastic engagement, as you identified, for Te Mauri o Te Wai, and that future work from this, like the blueprint for 2023, needs to build from that. And it needs to keep incorporating mātauranga Māori as, you know, a key framework for all future work around adaptive pathways. And also, you know, we need to keep rechecking with the schedule of issues of significance to make sure we're taking up those opportunities identified in there to incorporate those values and issues identified into the work. So that's just what that paragraph's identifying.
Thank you. So in identifying that, would your next piece of work, what is the approach? I guess what's the formality around identifying something?
Yep. So one of the things we will be looking at is all the foundational insights that have come through from the shoreline adaptation work that's in the next item, the information from Māori and mana whenua that's come through Te Tāruki a Tāwhiri and through Te Mauri o Te Wai, to make sure that that's a base where Māori iwi aren't having to repeat themselves, and we're drawing insights from that. So when we engage, we're not getting everyone to repeat everything. And so they're able to contextualise where this fits within the other work. But it also means that we'll be looking at the adaptive pathways. So that's what the next piece of work is. And looking at, you know, mātauranga Māori frameworks for adaptive pathways, such as, you know, ki uta ki tai, or kia whakatōmuri te haere whakamua, you know, looking at those concepts of pathways and how mātauranga Māori as a framework can fit within those, and talking with iwi about how they want them expressed. some of that is expressed in the water strategy and te taruke. It's about not duplicating.
Thank you. If I may, Mr. Chair, I've just got a second question.
Yeah.
Is that okay?
Yes, of course. Yes.
So that's good, and I'm hoping that when next this comes before us, we'll see the evidence of drawing different pieces of kōrero, because that's what we're all looking at, the integration component. So I'll leave that one there if I can, and wait for the next. Then, as you start talking about developing adaptive pathways and embedding mātauranga Māori, knowing that it varies between individual iwi, what is the thinking around that, please?
So one of the things the future path we need to take is make sure there are opportunities for that to be incorporated, and then talking with mana whenua around how they think they want to do that. Their view of how that gets incorporated spatially over time, with hapu, with whānau, with individuals. So it really is about, those conversations about that. But the pathways need to make sure the framework accommodates that, makes that a core part of it.
Yeah. So just to say, adaptive pathways is a bit of pioneering work. It'd be really good to see how that's formalised in a written form, so it's clearly evident. So thank you for those answers, and I look forward to
make one comment though. So like our maramataka is an adaptive pathway in a way. Some of the Māori concepts of ki to ki tai, which incorporate past, present, future, over time, integrated amongst people, amongst catchments. When you think of those concepts in a broad term, they are built-in adaptive pathways. And so sometimes when we think about that, because everyone thinks they're new, sometimes when you look at tikanga or mātauranga Māori or maramataka, they're actually built-in adaptive pathways and adaptive ways of thinking, which, combine past, present, future. So I suppose that's what we're saying when we're looking at that, is we already have some of those big, broad concepts that are adaptive pathways if you look to mātauranga Māori.
So just lastly, thank you for that. I could sit here and talk all meeting, but nobody else on here would wish to listen to me and you, or anyone for that matter, talk.
We all would.
So therefore I take it as read. I guess I'm just looking, because it's an important duty for us all to ensure that it's integrated well into the mahi that we do, which in this case is the Environment Committee. So I guess I'm just looking for something a lot more obvious for the next report. But thank you for your work.
Kia ora, Member Wilson, and I had similar questions in the pre-agenda when I saw the report, and also said to Katarina that you would likely have these questions. So I had the very good answer twice now from Katarina and team. So thank you for bringing those forward in the public forums, Member Wilson. As always, thank you. We have Councillor Walker, Pātai.
Sure. So I'm struggling to grapple with what we're doing here. I read the first point, which says approve the too much water statement as an accurate representation of Auckland Council's current role and direction. So when I read that, and I'm aware of a number of things, and I'll just run those things past you that I regard as an accurate representation, correct me if I'm wrong. We're not doing any monitoring and enforcement of impervious surface area, as far as I know. If we are, please advise. We are continuing to approve massive subdivisions in areas that are highly likely to be subject to inundation. Areas like Juri, for example, and there are any number of low-lying areas across Auckland that are going to be subject to flooding. And we know that there are many thousands of households that are subject to flooding of habitable areas now, and we are enlarging that circumstance. that we are not taking account of cumulative effects in our planning, and as a consequence, that is impacting on the risk that we face. And I could go on. If that is actually the circumstance, and I would also suggest that an accurate representation of climate change is well out of date. Currently, as we speak, across the Tasman, we see, I think, a 1 in 500 year or even more than that event that has taken place across a significant swathe of urban landscape. If we had something like that across our geography, the impact would be nothing short of devastating. And that is the climate change reality that is evidenced now across many parts of the planet.
Councillor
So
Walker,
my
there's a
question
really
is,
good, okay, thank you.
So my question is, and I have reiterated it, is this an accurate representation of our state in terms of what we are doing in terms of direction, and in particular not doing by way of direction? And does this significantly highlight, I would suggest, the massive risks that we face, particularly if there was a test of an event where our current measures that go to detention and retention simply do not work? So is this accurate? That's my question.
Kia ora, Councillor. So many of the issues that you have raised are reflected in some ways on page 7 in terms of we are playing multiple roles. We are not the only decision maker on those roles. We work within constraints and challenges in terms of the legislation we're working under. Courts and others are making decisions. National policy statements and standards are driving what we have to do. And so this document acknowledges those current roles, its challenges and its constraints. So it doesn't go into all of those in detail, but it does acknowledge the different roles we undertake and some of the things we have to do and some of the constraints in that. So I suppose it's an acknowledgement that we're often receiving national direction, and this acknowledges that.
So just going back to my part question around our monitoring and enforcement of impervious surface areas, isn't that relevant?
So that is a role that we undertake, yes.
And
this doesn't document every issue we have with every role we undertake. It's tried to identify some of the major challenges and constraints.
So my question around that is, if we're not doing that, should we not state that?
I'd have to talk, sorry, I don't have the detail from what current enforcement is being undertaken in that area. I can go and talk to Craig Hobbs, but that's not one of the real constraints that came through this process.
I reserve my right to speak, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Walker. Thank you, Kat. Councillor Stewart, question, part I.
Thank you. Okay, so that's a bit of a question. So we've got too much water, a statement for Auckland Council and current direction of where to. So this is all about improving and understanding the roles and responsibilities between central government and local government, insurance, social services and private individuals. Well, I'd just like to remind you, and it is going to be a bit of a question later on, back in 2013, when we were voting on the unitary plan, I can remember commenting on far too many water events. That was back in the early 2000s, and that was under Manukau City Council and the leadership of the wonderful Sir Barry Curtis, and the initiation of, from me, we had a moratorium that was in parts of Howick and Pakuranga that were known to have flooding issues whenever we had an extreme weather event. And so we've been having extreme weather events for a long, long time. And as Councillor Walker just commented, it looks like we're not even having more
Councillor
extreme.
Stewart,
I'm just going to speak, and I am asking questions because I tell you what, I've been listening all morning to everybody thanking this one and thanking that one. I'd like to thank this one and that one. So I'd just like to put my case ahead, if I may. I don't speak very often, and I did ask. So was it too much water? So I did put it as a question. So really the question is, do we have the tools, as I have been told by John Duguid a number of years ago, because I've been going on about this for a long time, that the unitary plan does have the tools to stop infill housing in areas that we know that we have these situations, and it doesn't appear that we're using it. So we're saying too much water. What can we do about it? And council and central government, insurance, everybody needs to be part of this. But for what I can see, we're just going round and round in circles, and we're not actually achieving anything. Thank you. Somebody can answer that question.
Kia ora, through the chair, I'm happy to take that. Thank you, Councillor Stewart, for your question. I think you've raised this a number of times, and I know that John and others have worked with you and gone out even on site to discuss it. So I'm not sure there's going to be anything else I can say that they haven't already said to you. In broad terms, yes, the unitary plan, under the RMA, we do have powers where we can restrict where development occurs. The fact that there is sometimes a flooding event or too much water is not necessarily under an effects-based regime, which is the RMA, doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot develop there. It's how you design the development so that it doesn't affect habitable rooms. But I'm wondering, Mr. Chair, I'm not sure I can go into too much more detail at this point. Again, if Councillor Stewart wants to take this further, I'm happy to connect her with John and continue the conversation. Thanks.
Well, that's good. Thank you for that. But I think it's almost time for the insurance councils to come out and have a look at some of these areas that we're talking about. I'd like to show them.
Thank you, Councillor. And I think, yeah, you've been very clear on these questions and comments, and happy for Megan to give you some more advice on that crucial issue. Deputy Mayor Bill Cashmore.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Excuse me for not putting my camera on. I would like to have pigeons fall out of the sky if I do that and disappear to face the earth. So, Katarina, and thank you for the work. Thank you. It's challenging stuff because this is going to be a work program. I'm seeing it as going forward, different iterations of it. At some point, I imagine we'll be saying, you know, this is what council will be responsible for. The Crown has primacy, so we can't change what they put through legislation. So we have to do that after we've advocated or made submissions on what they're proposing. But what they pass is primacy, and we have to then follow the directions. And intensification in urban areas is one point that's obviously challenging, and Councillor Stewart's right, she has some massive flooding issues in parts of her ward. But we also have situations in rural areas where you get big flood events and neighbouring properties, especially forestry blocks actually, they end up dumping huge volumes of materials over a whole bunch of little lifestyle blocks further downstream who have no capacity or capability to clean that up. So I imagine as part of this work, my question is, Katarina, will we be saying who is responsible for what as part of this work, or will it be done on a case-by-case basis?
Kia ora, Councillor Cashmore. That there will be options that will come to council. So you've rightly pitched that when things occur, people become then more interested in our service provider role. You know, will we be a service provider of flood protection schemes? Will we be a service provider where we help clean up damage, or we have pre-funding pools for recovery of events in the future, a bit like our superannuation fund is a pre-coverage for our ageing population. So they end up, while we have limitations as a regulator, which Councillor Newman, Councillor Walker and Councillor Stewart have identified, most Aucklanders also want to know, well, what services will you provide me? What will I have to do on my property myself? And what will you do for the community? And that is the part where decisions will need to be made that are fair both across the region, across generations, and across different types of people and land holdings. So, there's property owners, but then there's property owners who are also a business. So when flooding affects them, it affects their income as well as their property. It's the same with farms. It's affecting both the physical property and the farm. So those are what the big issues that Aucklanders want to know. What will you do? What will we do as a collective pool?
Thanks, Katarina. You're absolutely correct. As soon as something goes wrong, everyone puts their hand out and screams for council to go and fix it. So I'm looking forward to that piece of work. Hopefully it'll be done in the not too distant future. And we will have to have some fairness and equity right across the region around this piece, so that it's clear and evidently fair to everybody, but who carries the can for what. So thanks for your work. Looking forward to it. Cheers.
Kia ora.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor. And I think that's all for questions. So we'll go, thanks to the staff for all your answers, and we will let you turn off your screens and get a cup of tea. But yeah, thank you for that. It's complicated, and largely you're trying to bring everything together that we currently do, and that often we end up in a reactionary kind of space, and you're trying to get us in a proactive space. So thank you for that. So comment if you don't mind, Councillor Walker. I'll just go to Councillor Cooper first because she has to leave at midday. So I'll just skip to Councillor Cooper and then go Councillor Walker.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I just want to commend the staff for this work. And I mean, look, it hasn't got all the answers, but it certainly is a position statement. And that's what's really important, because what's been missing is no one really knowing who's responsible, no one really knowing who pays. We get into that word moral hazard is a really good word, because, you often making these decisions, when it is reactive, we kind of get forced into certain, decisions that we might not normally make if we were able to plan, or we'd had set out what our responsibility is, but also had a conversation with the public that, look, things are changing, the natural hazards are going to get worse. And so if we are building in these areas, is it right to keep doing that? We need to keep talking about this, and we need to kind of set up where we are now and grow from there, because I think that as we see, there are so many more natural hazards that will occur, and I don't think anyone's really ready for them. So we have to take some leadership in stating where we're at this point. And we cannot, we are in a bit of a cleft stick, as the Deputy Mayor said. We're stuck by legislation. We don't know what's coming, but we've got to set out our statement now and start this conversation. So thank you for all the work. And I support us being brave enough to start having this conversation. And I'll have to leave now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councillor Cooper, and thank you for your comments as always. And we will see you sometime soon. Good luck with your council event. Sorry, Councillor Walker. I accidentally missed off Councillor Newman, and sorry about that, Daniel. So, Councillor Newman, if you want to go ahead of Councillor Walker.
Thanks so much. I don't mind deferring to Wayne, but look, there is so much moral hazard that ultimately falls on people saying, well, the council needs to fix it. I can't believe how many requests I get, which are clearly beyond the scope of local government, but we seem to be the last man standing to fix all problems in life. But in relation to too much water, and just digressing, if I may, Chair, I think that I really appreciate what Kat has tried to pick up the issues that I've raised. But if there's one thing that I really believe needs to form the basis of advocacy for too much water, it is in advocacy to central government and the RM reforms. And there's two things that, and I'm happy to put them in writing, but just to convey, if officers are listening, there's two things that too much water need to reiterate to MFE who I assume are holding the pen on resource management reforms in the too much, in relation to too much water. And that is that any changes to the Resource Management Act need to entrench the requirement for new residential and commercial, but primarily residential subdivisions, including infill subdivisions, to ensure hydrological neutrality, i.e. that a development needs to basically be able to prove how it will mitigate its own stormwater effects. That's number one. And number two, we need to, through our too much water advocacy to central government in the RM space, require that the Resource Management Act reforms allow for consenting authorities such as Auckland Council to be able to consider the cumulative effects of stormwater and to be able to object to the applications for consents when the cumulative effects of stormwater in that catchment are such that it is more than minor and that there is a significant risk of flooding. And I say this in particular, noting that under Three Waters reform, we're not going to, in theory, be responsible for stormwater because that goes off to this new entity. But we are the regulatory authority, and therefore we should have an absolute interest in ensuring that if we're not the owner and we're not the funder of the stormwater infrastructure, that we can require it as part of our consideration as to cumulative effects. And if I can conclude, Chair, I think before Kat and her team try and write any policy material for central government, noting that they are the policy analysts for council, it is quite possible for them to be able to have conversations with Healthy Waters with a view to getting the case study material for every single subdivision the last 5 years, where Healthy Waters knew that the subdivision would likely to have a significant effect in terms of compromising our stormwater network, raised concern, but the development of the subdivision was still consented anyway. So we have the information within the council, within the Healthy Waters team, that should be able to prove time and time again the case studies that have been raised by Councillor Stewart in particular and by other people, but Sharon has really led on this, that needs to form the basis for our arguments to central government around too much water. So I'd like us to see the requirement to entrench hydrological neutrality, and I'd also like the required consenting authority, in this case being Auckland Council, being able to consider cumulative effects as a consideration when considering these applications, noting what we already are aware of in relation to increased stormwater flooding as a result of two things: one, climate change, and two, the move from permeable to non-permeable surfaces. Thank you.
Kia ora, Councillor Newman. Thank you. Councillor Walker.
Sure, Mr. Chair. I understand in part why this item has been put up. Having said that, I do not believe, first of all, that it's an accurate representation. That's point one. And under point 5, in terms of the council fulfilling its leadership role and responsibility as a unitary authority in response to too much water events, I don't agree with that. That goes further to the comments that Councillor Newman and Councillor Stewart have made, and further takes a consistent, planned and equitable response to too much water risks and events. I take issue with that. So my suggestion, Mr. Chair, is that it would be very useful to test this circumstance, and let's say there's a worst case scenario that is a stormwater event the like, or a storm event the likes of what they're experiencing in parts of Australia, to varying degrees. What does that look like in terms of what's being portrayed here, in terms of risks and accountabilities and what we could and should have been doing and are not? Without that, this, frankly, is a lot of talk. And certainly in terms of anybody out there being able to comprehend it, I don't think adequately portrays it. So what actually happens in an event? And we will have an event of high order magnitude at some point in the future, and that future is looming ever closer. And I bring to your attention the things that we could and should be doing under the RMA, like monitoring and enforcement as it goes to impervious surface areas, that to my knowledge we're not doing anything about whatever. And the approval of consents, as Councillor Newman and Councillor Stewart have made in many locations where it is known that they will be subject to inundation and the massive cost attached to that. So I'll be voting against this, Mr. Chair, because I do not think it's an accurate representation to the extent that it would need to be. And I think at a point in time when we do have a storm event and people look back at meetings like this and they look back at, you know, what was put up to us, they'll really say, well, what were these people doing? Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Kia ora, Councillor Walker. And Councillor Stewart, you know, I apologise for, I just wanted to make sure you're getting question and comments in this, if you'd like to continue the comments that you were speaking, please let me know if you'd like to speak.
No, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Stewart. And yes, just want to acknowledge the team that this is largely trying to pull everything together that we are and aren't doing, as many councillors would say. And in Councillor Stewart's point, it does seem that we need this to guide us and understand where exactly we can change things and what we can do going forward, because I think that is the confusion for the public, most definitely, when they see things that just don't make sense, that council are having to approve resource consents in places which are clearly not fit for purpose, but we are hamstrung by the RMA. And we do hope that the central government changes and the adaptation policies will help change that direction. We have spoken a lot about flooding specifically in this discussion, but this too much water statement is also around the coastal erosion, which we will talk a bit more about under the next item. But that's also as crucial. People do wonder why or how we are letting developments happen right on the coastline when our plans say that, you know, they'll be underwater within, you know, 20 or 30 years, let alone 50. And as Councillor Walker and others have said, when you've got issues like we've seen in Australia at the moment, or the Northwest a few months ago, that, you know, this can be underwater within a year. So, yeah, I think there are massive issues that we are trying to grapple with, but we don't have the tools, or we legally can't enact the tools we think we have because of the way and the powers we do have or don't have. So I think this is a really good start, bringing it all together, but I think it'll give us and the public a lot more answers when we have it all come together, and maybe the way forward on advocating or being able to enact those changes. I was rounding up there, but I'll just get, I see that Councillor Sayers has put his comment forward. So just last comment from Councillor Sayers, and then we will go to the vote.
Yeah, thank you, Richard. Look, just picking up on your point there, just endorsing your last comments, Richard. I wasn't going to comment, but I endorse what you've said. It's not only water, it's also, I guess, traffic, you know, and cars as the intensification in Auckland opens up for housing. It's not just the water supply, but also the effect of traffic on communities and traffic congestion and therefore their emissions. So it's a difficult situation that the council finds itself in. It has to process it as a regulatory body, but and within the rules of our own planning and zoning requirements. But yeah, I'm not quite sure what the answer is there, Richard, but it is a concern, and if we can address it somehow, it is important. But I just want to bring up that it's not only water, but also traffic.
Kia ora. Thank you, Councillor Sayers. Right, we'll go to the vote. All those in favour, please say aye.
Aye.
And
Aye.
anyone who would like anyone who is opposed?
Yes, I'm opposed. Thank you.
And you'd like
Yes.
you'd like that recorded, Councillor Stewart, Councillor Walker?
Yes,
Thank you.
please.
Cool. Thank you both. Right, and now we will. Don't know if it's quite lunchtime yet. We might have a 10-minute. Wait, I'll just ask Sue.